Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you all for coming out here tonight. It's such a pleasure for me to be here. It's always a pleasure for me to come and talk in Salt Lake City, because it recalls to my mind the first time that I came to talk here. One of the first talks I gave after The End of Nature came out, and Terry Tempest Williams had me out to speak, and so anytime I'm here, it's with that deep friendship in my mind, and now also with other friends, with figures like Rocky Anderson and others that I associate this city with now, and of course the just jaw-dropping beauty of the Wasatch. It's a special pleasure to be in this building where I'd never been before. What an amazing temple this place is, and how lucky you are to have it. And what fun to know that Chip played some role, in Chip Ward, in making this real. This is a really special place. And you know, libraries in general, since we're going to talk a little bit about literature tonight, you know, libraries in general are one of the great institutions that we have in our society. It's one of the things that makes me very pleased to be a writer. It's an odd economy, writing. You know, people buy just enough books to keep writers hopefully in business, and I'm extraordinarily grateful to your local bookstore, King's English, which you all know well enough to support, because if you don't, you'll end up like too many other towns that don't have them anymore. But it's also wonderful to know that when you write something, it's going to be accessible to everyone, and it's going to be, I mean, this is the one institution in American society devoted to the idea of sharing things. Devoted to the idea that not everybody has to own one of everything. And I don't quite know why it is that we chose books as the thing. I mean, you know, in an age to come, when we're a little wiser, we'll probably do the same thing with tools and with automobiles, if we still have them, and with sporting equipment, and you know, all sorts of other things. But it is really nice always to know that my work is available to everybody in the country who can make it to their nearest library. Now, I'm going to talk about literature tonight a little bit, but I got to confess that it's been a less literary year or two than usual for me, because I've spent much of my time engaged in political organizing, about which more later at the end, because the topic is the way that environmental writing connects to environmental action and has in our history. What I have managed to immerse myself part-time in, though, for the last year or two, is, for me, the new business of anthologizing, which means immersing oneself in deep memory and in recollection and in trying to catch the threads of connection in disparate work. The publisher just came out with an anthology of my own work last week, creatively titled The Bill McKibben Reader. And in April, the Library of America will publish this extraordinarily thick anthology that I edited for them, a book called American Earth, American Environmental Writing Since Thoreau. Now, in a sense, this all makes me feel very old, and at 47, I may in a certain sense be too young to be a very good anthologist, to really understand the perspective in which even my own work should be put. But there's something very useful about seeing where you've been and what you've thought, and trying to understand the larger current into which one's own work flows, the great river of which any of us who do this kind of writing are small tributaries. I think that American writing about nature and the environment is the greatest of literary rivers on this continent. I think it is our greatest contribution to world letters. Other societies and civilizations have been around much longer and have had more time, I think, to develop the exquisite art of looking at the relations between human beings, which are the dominant subject of the novel or of the drama or of the poem. And so I think it is no accident that probably the greatest novels in world literature come from other places, or maybe some of the greatest drama. But ours was the only continent on which people were fully literarily conscious at the same time that we were engaged in the subduing of that continent, engaged in the act of in many ways, taking apart our environment. That had happened long before in Asia and Europe, really long before they came to full literary consciousness. And so you get odd and fascinating echoes, you know, even back into the sort of earliest literature we know. Things like Gilgamesh, you're already hearing the echoes and distant stories of the time before the great deforestations of the Mediterranean and so forth. For us, the New World, we were fully conscious when all this was going on, and so it became one of the great themes and stories and cruxes of our literature. And I think it is no accident that in many ways Thoreau is the fountainhead of much of modern American thinking and writing. The art of anthologizing is the art of imposing more connection than may be there on disparate pieces of writing. It's a kind of meta-criticism, and it should be taken with a large grain of salt. Everything I say tonight, at least about literature, should be taken with a large grain of salt. But I think that they are deep and discernible patterns in the American response to the natural world. Not completely chronologically, and that's because Thoreau represents such a problem. He was so deep, so weird, so prescient. His antennae were so sensitive that he was in many ways 100 or 150 years ahead of his time, and there are only now, I think, large chunks of Thoreau that we're coming to fully appreciate and understand and able to make sense of. And it's no wonder that the world, you know, into which he published his books had no idea what he was talking about. That Thoreau, having gotten the returns from his publisher, remarked that he had a library of 850 books, 700 of which he'd written himself. It's easier almost to begin with the next iconic figure, I think, in American nature writing, John Muir, who sums up so much of the history of the modern environmental idea. Born in urban Scotland, growing up in a kind of Bible-haunted and largely dysfunctional family on the Wisconsin frontier, and finding enormous release and solace in the wild when he was finally able to strike out for it, first on his amazing 1,000-mile walk to the Gulf from Kentucky down to Cedar Key in Florida, and then most memorably, of course, in the High Sierra, where in the granite fastness of the Yosemite, he invented a grammar, a rhetoric, a vocabulary of wildness that we use to this day, and that continues to be, I think, kind of the motive energy of much of American environmentalism. You will notice that the one thing that all environmental groups in this country have in common is that they produce calendars each year. And as an Easterner, you know, there's always one page someplace in there devoted to the East, and it's always the same picture, 3 or 4 brightly colored leaves floating on a puddle, you know. But it's the great scenes of the West that really, in a sense, sprang to life in Muir's imagination more than anyone, first to completely understand the incredible crystalline beauty that means that American necks have turned west for 100 years whenever we've thought about the wild. And from Muir, Ansel Adams, and from Muir, quite literally, of course, the Sierra Club. And the prototypical, not only environmental NGO, but the prototypical nonprofit crusading organization of any kind anywhere in the world. An invention so important that we can hardly even measure it at this point. And from Muir, the great chain of successors, people like David Brower, who institutionalized that view of the world in a way with the magnificent Sierra Club coffee table books of the 1960s that permanently fixed that, I think, that kind of image in our minds. That deep fascination with the wild is with us still, as it should be. And of course, to talk about any of this without paying reference to Wallace Stegner would be a great mistake, or also to your other great semi-native son, Ed Abbey, the great evangel of wildness in our time, and another friend who I think about constantly when I'm here in these places. But that kind of environmentalism, crucial as it is, has limits. That motive power, sort of summoned up by that vision of wildness, by definition, concentrates around the margins. I mean, it's the reason that the places that we've been able to preserve as wild have largely been those places that weren't wanted for anything else. The rocks and the ice and the desert wastes, as one might have it. There's a certain limitation that comes with grandeur, though it's been, as I say, the motive force of our environmentalism for 100 years. One can almost feel that force running out in recent times, feel its inability to power us as we now face this next wave of great environmental challenges exemplified by climate change that cause us not to deal with the margins at all, but to have to go to the very center of our economy, of our politics, of our society, of our cultural life, if we're ever going to get a hold of them. And I don't think that the power generated by that idea of wilderness is enough, at least by itself, to get us over those hurdles. It was enough, maybe, to get us through Earth Day and to get us to preserve the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and all those other very good things, but not, I think, to deal with what we need to deal with now. Which is why it's very good news that by mid-century, there was another emerging strain in American environmentalism, in American environmental writing first, that I think is of enormous importance, and in the end may turn out to be more important. And that was exemplified maybe first by Aldo Leopold, who was a scientist, the first really game management professional, and many of you have read his incredible account of his kind of, Saul on the Damascus Road experience of watching the death of a wolf in the New Mexico mountains, a wolf that he or his crew had shot, and watching its fierce green fire in its eyes die, and realizing that this was not only a kind of act of singular desecration, but an act of ecological desecration, one that served to sever the bonds that made that mountain, that landscape, that ecosystem work. The great science of the 20th century, I think we'll realize 150 or 200 years from now, was not nuclear physics, and it wasn't even computer science, it was ecology. The dawning understanding that everything was connected, the great challenge to the reductionism that had begun in the beginning of the Enlightenment and had come to dominate all our way of thinking, now challenged by this strong sense of the way that everything was tied to everything else. And out of that grew Leopold's ecological ethic, his land ethic, but also the kind of nascent sense that human communities were going to have to be a very important part of this equation. With Rachel Carson, we reach the moment when we begin to realize that there's no way to escape our irresponsibility, that there aren't two realms, the kind of industrial one and the wild one, that the poisons we're pouring into our industrial world are leaking into every corner of our planet. The first real shadow cast over modernity, or really the second one. The first came with the birth of atomic weapons at the end of the Second World War. But that was a loss of innocence that in a sense we could postpone. And we have postponed since. We haven't dropped any more of them. Not true with how we've dealt with the environment. Rachel Carson marks the first real tarnish on the idea of modernity and the inevitable triumph of progress at all times, and that shadow haunts us still. The idea that we need a new sense of who we are, I think, is what permeates nature and environmental writing in the kind of post-Carson era and the Earth Day era up to the present. And maybe its preeminent voice, and I'm so glad to hear that he'll be here next year, is Wendell Berry, the Kentucky farmer and essayist, and for my money, the greatest writer at work in our country today, and a wonderful man and a dear friend. His picture of human community, a picture so lovely that it hurts almost to read it and to contemplate it and to contemplate the gulf between one's own life and one's own society and that working human community. That, I think, is the dominant tone, the most important tone in environmental writing and thinking of the present moment. A spirit extraordinarily strong, it seems to me, in your homegirl, Terry Tempest Williams. Refuge takes Leopold and the land ethic to its next logical place. Terry is an ethical writer, if there ever was one. And it's to your enormous credit that she's a prophet with honor in her own land, and one of my real inspirations as a writer. I even, as I was anthologizing my own work, could see some of this transition myself. The End of Nature, which was this first book about climate change, is in many ways, it's partly just reporting on what was going on since no one had done it before, but it's also a meditation on wildness, a kind of elegy for a wild world that will never be as wild again. It's definitely a young man's book, wild, with its concentration on that. And in the years since, for me, I've grown steadily towards a fascination with human communities as the way out of the trap into which we have fallen. And most recently, this book of mine, Deep Economy, which came out last year, and in a certain way represents the summation of a lot of my thinking on these questions. The idea that what's happened in America far more dangerously than the spread of particular chemicals or the, different obvious environmental harms that we've subjected ourselves to, that far more dangerous than that for the last 100 years has been the pervasive, almost overwhelming spread of a kind of hyper-individualism that has separated us one from another so profoundly that we're no longer, we find it extraordinarily difficult to be what human beings were meant to be, in communion with each other, in communion with the world around them. And the book is set of very hard-headed economic ideas about the recovery of the kind of local institutions that might allow us to go back in that direction. Institutions like libraries, institutions like farmers markets, institutions like local currencies, institutions like much more localized energy grids, all the kind of things that might pull us back together, knit us back together, so we could somehow escape from this prison of hyper-individualism that a century of cheap fossil fuel and ultra-consumption has put us into. For me, therefore, I guess, the farmer's market has become as interesting as the wilderness area. And the bus stop has become as interesting as the mountaintop. Not more interesting, I'm interested in all of them. But I don't see any way to protect the mountaintop without the bus stop. And I don't see any way that we're going to have a wild or even a habitable America without the farmer's market and all the things that it stands for. There's another idea that I have about environmentalism and writing. It's born out of a question that sort of started occurring to me a number of years ago. Now, I've been around a number of writing communities in my life. As a young man, I was at the New Yorker. First 5 years out of college, wrote the Talk of the Town column for the New Yorker and other things. And It was quite a privilege to be there, and of course one of the privileges was getting to see all the kind of real writers, at work, and all the poets and the essayists and the critics and things. Writing, the literary world can be a fairly, this will not come as news, I suppose, but it did to me at the time, a fairly ego-ridden place. And it was very odd as I went on and found myself a small part of the community of nature writers. The thing that struck me most about it was, in comparison, how almost egoless it was, how little competition and how much sort of brotherhood and sisterhood there was, the sort of opposite of the kind of jealousy or envy or things that often marks many literary communities. And there are some structural reasons for that. One, I think, is that it's been very helpful for it to be largely outside academia. Though academia is a wonderful thing, its basic mode of operation is, of course, the dialectic and the idea that you look at things and try to knock them down and discover what you think is wrong with them. And that has certain virtues, especially when you're doing hard science. But it's been much more fun to be in a community that proceeds more by synthesis, by looking at other people's work and saying, what is useful here? What is beautiful here? What informs my own sense of the world? There's that structural reason, but I think much more there are two things going on. One is that it's a community of people who spend a lot of time outdoors. And when you spend a lot of time outdoors, it becomes much, much harder to maintain the illusion that you're all that important. And much easier to realize that you're a small part of something very large, a realization that Americans, by the most part, have lost, and much to our detriment. I remember once taking a group of high school kids out camping in the Adirondacks, where I lived, and the Adirondacks, it's like here, it's like, parts of Utah, extraordinarily dark skies, the darkest skies in the east, and this was the new moon, and there's no, you could just see every star, just gorgeous. And I had 6 or 7 kids out there, and they were high school seniors, and it transpired that 5 of them no one had ever shown them the Milky Way in the course of their lives, And I was just sort of struck dumb by this idea. And of course, they responded just the right. Once I sort of showed it to them, they're like, did just the right response. They were like, "Yo, freak me out, dude." Which is, basically when we must have become humans. When some ape looked up and said, "Yo, freak me out. Look at all those stars." That sort of sense of being a very small part of something very vast and very beautiful, something we've lost. So there's that time outside. There's also, importantly, the fact that all the environmental writers that I know, without exception, are also, to one degree or another, activists, working on things of enormous importance to them and others, and in need of each other's help, and wanting each other's help, and hence not at all competitive. So, Rick Bass in the Yak Valley, or Terry hard at work in the Canyonlands, or Barry Lopez, or Richard Nelson in Alaska working to save the Tongass, or Janice Ray in the Southland, or Michael Pollan, who will be here this week, now emerging as a really kind of critical voice as we consider farm policy and things. This strain of activism in this literary community, which I think is fairly unique among literary communities, goes way back, of course. It goes right back to the beginning. It goes back to Thoreau in his jail cell, to George Perkins Marsh, the great 19th century writer of the book Man and Nature, who really is in some ways the father of national parks in a profound way. Of course, to Muir and the Sierra Club, to Leopold, to Carson, right on up. And I've found my own self, and here I'll switch gears and sort of close a little bit by talking about my own work in the last few years and how this is, what this has meant to me. I've always been something of an activist and worked hard on wilderness issues in the Adirondacks and that kind of thing. But about 18 months ago, and I was telling this story earlier today at the Stegner Symposium and thinking about 18 months ago, I just fell into a kind of deep despair about how little was being done about climate change, this issue I've been working with and covering and writing about and speaking about for 20 years. How nothing was happening in Washington, how we had responded in no way in this country, in any real way, to the single biggest problem that human beings have ever faced. And it didn't seem enough to just keep writing about it. And there didn't seem to be any kind of real movement to plug into about it. So almost by accident, started creating one. Now, we started with this march across the state of Vermont, and I called up a bunch of friends of mine and said, we got to take this walk. And I started sending out emails. And after about 3 weeks after I started, I'm just completely, the keynote here that I want you to think about is clueless, okay, and amateur, and didn't know what I was doing. We started this march across Vermont. We left from Robert Frost's old summer riding cabin up in the Green Mountains, because he's sort of the patron saint of certain ways of our mountains. And we walked for 5 days up to Burlington, our main city, and by the time we got to Burlington, you know, we'd camp in fields at night and things. There were 1,000 of us marching, which in Vermont is just way more people than anyone ever sees anytime, you know. Terrifying number of people. And it was great. It got all of our representatives, all the people who were running for Senate and Congress came down and did a big final rally, and they met with us and they signed our pledge to what at the time was the very radical notion that we would work in Congress to cut carbon emissions 80% by 2050. It was really good. In fact, I told the story this afternoon of the woman who was running for Congress on the GOP ticket, and she had said 2 months before that she, you know, in her announcement speech, she said she didn't know if global warming was real or not, and more research needed to be done. The research that needed to be done, it turned out, was how many people would walk across Vermont. And the finding was that 1,000 was enough. And because she signed this pledge and she worked hard, she made it a centerpiece of her campaign, and it was great. The only thing that wasn't great, it was really, I mean, what was important about it for me and for others was to have the unhealthy cynicism with which we'd been operating removed a little bit. To see the sort of system working the way that it's always sort of supposed to. And realizing that one of the reasons that it hadn't worked maybe so well was because we hadn't been pushing it to. There was a story in the newspaper the next day in Burlington saying that 1,000 people probably represented the largest demonstration about climate change that had yet taken place in the United States. Okay? Which seemed to us that we needed to try to change. And so we decided to see if we could be more than just old crazy Vermont that would do this. And so we, January 10th of last year, we opened this website. Me, 6 kids, 6 college kids. One of them had just graduated, 5 were seniors about to graduate. We opened this website, stepitup07.org. We didn't have any money, and we didn't have any mailing list or anything else. We just started sending out emails to everybody we could think of saying, will you organize a demonstration in your community about 3 months hence, April 14th, with this same demand, 80% by 2050. Clueless, amateur, and not really knowing what we were doing. And people responded in the most remarkable way. 12 weeks later, on April 14th, we had 1,400 demonstrations in all 50 states. It was the biggest day of grassroots environmental activism since Earth Day in 1970. And extraordinarily beautiful. The point I really want to make about it is the level of creativity that people brought to it. We didn't want to have a march on Washington and everybody listen to a bunch of speeches. It seemed crazy to everybody drive across the country spewing carbon to, you know, protest global warming. And we figured people would know how to do this in their own places, and by God, they did. I wish I could show you the pictures of the underwater demonstrations by scuba divers off the endangered coral reefs of Key West, or thousands of people in blue shirts in lower Manhattan forming this sea of people to show where the tide line will be in the most expensive real estate in the world, or the people skiing in formation down in the Sierras and the Rockies, down glaciated peaks that won't be glaciated much longer, all on and on and on. It was fantastic. Extremely democratic. And this is a moment, an age, with many problems. I mean, the biggest problem we've ever faced, climate change. But it's also an age, in certain ways, of enormous democratic potential for doing just this kind of thing. We have a set of tools all of a sudden that allow for a kind of democracy of creativity that we haven't had before. And it's fascinating to see those things starting to happen, some of them very practical. To me, the most interesting thing that's happened in the presidential election this winter is that, Barack Obama's raised $100 million, $25 at a time from normal people. Not from the few centers of power in this society, but just by people going online and giving him their credit cards, And that presages a different kind of political future if we could make it happen. But it also is in much more creative ways too. The rise of the internet offers lots of drawbacks, and I'm well aware of all of them, but it also offers real license and ability for people to take their creativity out in public in a way that they haven't before. And to kind of see the rise of fascinating. Is there anybody in this room who didn't see that Obama video that people put together on YouTube a few weeks ago? People were viewing it by the tens of millions across the country, a work of great beauty, and many, many other things like it. We need very much in the environmental movement that kind of creativity unleashed. The environmental movement has been many things in recent years. It's been professional, it's been successful at many of its tasks, it's been rigorous. One can't say that it's been overwhelmingly creative, that it's brought to bear the spirit that it needs to, I think, in order to really go to the next level. And so what I want to finish by tonight is making a little pitch to y'all, since you're by definition creative people. Here you are in a library for a talk about writing and things, to figure out how to put your own wits to use in this task ahead of us. The kids that I did this Step It Up thing with last year and I are launching a new project this year. In fact, it's officially launching today. The website opened today. You're the first people who know about it. And it's an attempt to do the same thing that we did last year with this Step It Up demonstration, which, by the way, was very successful. That 80% by 2050 demand that we talked about, by the time we'd done all those demonstrations on April 14th, all the Democratic presidential candidates had signed on to what had been this radical and fringe idea. And whoever wins that particular shootout is going to be bearing that standard into their administration, should they win. It's helped change the debate, and that was because there were people around the country who figured out, including here in Salt Lake City, where we had a tremendous Step It Up demonstration on April 14th with thousands and thousands of people that Rocky Anderson and many others helped organize, and I'm grateful to the people in this room who did that. What we're launching today is a new organization trying to do the same thing on a global basis, because they don't call it global warming for nothing. Only half the task is getting our own house in order. The other half is figuring out how to get the same kind of movement going in places around the world, especially the developing world, where there hasn't been any pressure to do any kind of political work on this, in places where people are going to get so monumentally wrecked by change in climate. I mean, it's going to harm us, but we're rich. We can deal with it to a certain degree for a certain way. Long before we're derelict as a result, it's going to have killed and made refugees out of hundreds of millions of people around the poor parts of this world, around the coastal fringes of Asia and Latin America and many other places. And I could sit here all night and tell you stories. The organization that we're launching, and we're going to pass around sign-up sheets, because as I say, I'm trying to be an activist now, doing my best. I want you all to participate, and I want you to know about it. We want to be able to get in touch with you. The organization that we're launching has an odd name, 350.org, 350.org. I'm going to make you pay attention just for 1 minute to some science, okay? The most important number in the world right now is 350, as in parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Before the Industrial Revolution, there were 275 parts per million carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. Right now, there are 385 parts per million CO2 in our atmosphere, thanks to all the gas and oil and coal that we've burned in the last 200 years. Because there are 385 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, a lot of bad things are happening. Seasons are shifting, mosquitoes are spreading, drought is becoming endlessly more of a problem in arid areas. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold. And once that water is up in the atmosphere, it's coming down in great deluges and floods across moist areas. Maybe most dramatically, we saw last fall the rapid and almost unbelievable melt of Arctic ice in the course of weeks, when areas the size of California were disappearing out of that Arctic ice cap every week, and with the most horrible results. I mean, we've taken that beautiful white shield across the top of our globe that reflects 80% of incoming solar radiation right back out to space. It's like a great mirror, and replacing it with blue water that absorbs 80% of that incoming solar radiation that just amps up this whole reaction. We've gone too far. We're way out of the safety zone. We've got to figure out very quickly how to cut back, how to stop producing much carbon dioxide at all on this planet, so that the natural systems of the Earth can cleanse some of it out of there and get us back to something that approaches a safe zone. That safe zone, defined by our foremost climatologist, Jim Hansen at NASA, as being 350 parts per million or less. That's the challenge for our time on Earth. A challenge every bit as profound as people faced, you know, at the beginning of the Second World War, when they had to figure out how to stop fascism in its tracks. A challenge every bit as big as faced by people in the time of the Civil Rights Movement, when they had to figure out how to peacefully end the shame of segregation in this society. This, for us, in our time on Earth, is the greatest challenge that there's ever been, and if we don't get it right, people will know that for hundreds of thousands of years to come, because we will alter and degrade the geography and geology of this planet forever. So our simple hope is that we can build a movement that will have as its goal in the next few years to take this number 350 and tattoo it into people's brains, to make everybody around the world understand what that number is and what it means, more or less. At least to understand that it represents, for our planet, the third one out from the sun, that it represents safety, that it represents the future of our enterprise here on this planet. And we don't know how to do this quite. We have some ideas, but we need lots more. That's why we need you signed up on this website, giving us ideas and contacts about how to make this happen. Not waiting for, you know, a fundraising appeal from the Audubon Society, not waiting to read a book, or not waiting for, you know, some great leader to be elected president and make it all happen. Instead, taking up our duty as creative people, as citizens, as neighbors, to make this happen and make it happen fast. So please, go to that website, log on to it, give us your name so we can track you down as we go along. Come up more than anything else with the kind of ideas, whatever they are, that would make this real. Now, we were having, just in the course of the afternoon, as I was talking about this with people kept coming up with great ones. Someone said, well, I'm going to be helping organize the Bluegrass Festival in Telluride. I bet we can get 350 banjo players out on stage at the same time, you know? There's a good one. There's hundreds of ideas like that out there, and we need you to figure them out. And we need you to make this part of the message of whatever other group and cause and things that you're involved with, because no other cause can prosper on this planet if it has to somehow contend with the incredible degradation bearing down upon us now from climate. You can tell I'm still a little amateur at this organizing stuff. It doesn't come naturally to me. I don't really feel comfortable doing it. I'm a writer. I want to be holed up in my room writing. But instead, here I am out here talking and doing my best to get you all involved. And I thank you enormously for getting involved. Let me just end by saying, as I said earlier today, that I have no guarantee that any of this is actually going to work. We're in enormous trouble. Sea ice is melting at an astonishing rate. With it, the possibility of disastrous rises in sea level before the century is out. Trouble that the world has never faced. And the momentum behind it is extraordinarily strong. The one thing to be said in conclusion is that if the history of environmental and nature writing in this country in the last 150 years teaches us anything, it's that the more trouble in which the world gets, the more people there are who rise to its eloquent defense. There's almost an inverse relationship between the trouble and danger and damage and the sense of beauty and bearing witness that writers and photographers and artists and musicians have brought to bear. And we need to up that ante one more time. We desperately need you, all of you, in that crew of people working somehow to try to figure out how we're going to pull this off. Thank you very much. Thank you very kindly. That's very kind. And now I think we've got, yes, microphones maybe out there for questions or comments or abuse or whatever would be fine. I'm game for anything.
Having seen an actual glacier falling off in Alaska when we were on a ferry boat. Luckily, we had a great captain. We didn't die. I can testify to what's happening. But what surprises me is some people who call themselves scientists are still saying this does not exist. Although you gave very precise information with the 350 carbon monoxide data, how are we going to make sure these other people finally realize this?
Well, there's actually an extraordinarily strong scientific consensus on this, more than on almost anything one can think of. I mean, the idea that humans are warming the world is basically uncontested by serious science. And in fact, it's a idea that's pretty much carried the day even in American public opinion. 70% of Americans say that global warming is a serious problem and that we need to do something about it soon. Which to get 70, I mean, this is a country where 50% or more of people believe that Elvis remains alive, okay? So to get 70% agreement on anything is a remarkable, accomplishment. There are two problems. One, there are people with enormous vested interest in making sure that nothing happens. And, they tend to be coal companies and oil companies, and they have the resources, and in our political system, resources play an awfully large role in your power of your voice. That's one problem. The other problem is the kind of inertia of all the rest of us. We're deeply enmeshed in the habits of our lives, and it is uncomfortable to imagine changing them in any real way. And so we don't speak up as much as we should. The real problem is getting some pretty small percentage of that 70% to actually speak out strong, really strong. It doesn't take 51% of people to make change. It takes, if you can get 15% of people, that's way more than enough, as long as they're making some noise. And that's what we found with Step It Up. All these people signing on, and the reason they were signing on was because they kept saying, you know, I've done the thing, I'm sort of haunted by all this. I've done the things I'm supposed to do in my house. I've screwed in the new light bulb, you know. But even as I was screwing it in, I was thinking, this probably will not solve global warming. What can I really do? Our kind of unofficial mantra became, screw in the new light bulb, then screw in the new senator, you know. And the second more important than the first. If we don't act on this politically, you know, all the kind of bike riding and composting and whatever else good things we're going to do isn't going to get it done in the time that we have to get it done. We got to work nationally and internationally to make this happen, even as we're also working to build the strong local communities that will reduce our impact and allow us to survive that which we can't reduce. We got to work on all those levels, and it's much more fun to work on the local one in many ways. That's what I really like doing, you know, farmers markets and on and on and on. But it's imperative that we work at least some on the national and international level too, and there's plenty of ways to link them. Someone gave me a flyer today for a rally that's going to take place April 5th here in Salt Lake City. And it's about all kinds of different important issues in the war and healthcare and things. But they said that they would have a big 350 banner there at that thing, just to remind us that even as we're talking about all these other issues, looming over them all the time, looming over all of us all the time, is this single most important thing going on in the earth. The just constant wasting away of the essential feature of our planet, its stable climate.
Of the announced presidential candidates, which is most in accord with your way of thinking?
Well, as I say, both of the Democrats have signed on to these principles we've asked them to. And frankly, John McCain, of all the Republicans in the Senate, has been the best on this. And that's not saying an enormous amount, it should be said, but he's, you know, provided leadership for a long time. His policy is pretty much sort of state-of-the-art 2001 or something, you know, pretty good back then, not up to what we need now, but, you know, much better than the possible alternatives. The reason we got to vote in Vermont last week, and it actually counted, you know, extraordinarily enough. And the reason that I voted for Obama was because you know, the second half of this equation involves not just dealing with what we need to do here, but somehow managing to bring the rest of the world, you know, exert real leadership in the rest of the world. I spend a lot of time traveling around the world, especially in the developing countries. You can't believe how much people hate us now in the rest of the world, and with fairly good reason. And one of the few quick, cheap things that we could do that might have some hope of turning that around, it seems to me, is to kind of elect a skinny black guy named, you know, with a funny name. Would at the very least cause people in the rest of the world to think there's more at work in America than perhaps I quite realize. So that's why I voted for him, but, you know. And I was glad to see that your neighbors next door in Wyoming seem to have done the same today. You know, there's something about northern climes and Obama that he's done very well. The colder it gets, the better he seems to do.
Is Obama more in line with your way of thinking than Ralph Nader?
Yes, much more, because my way of thinking has something to do with effective political action in our society.
Two questions. One on your recent anthology, which I haven't read, and the other
no one's read it. It's
on your more current passion. A friend of mine and I were walking in Zions and finding it beautiful, but there seems to be a paradox there. We're in a land where, without outside support, including what we packed in, we'd be dead within a week. Is there any insight in the nature writers that you've looked at as to why humans find desolate places, places not conducive to human survival, beautiful?
Yeah, I think that I think that goes right to that question that I was saying before about the need to feel the rightness of feeling small. Everything in our culture tells us to feel big all the time. I did this strange book once called The Age of Missing Information, where I had people tape for me everything that came across the largest cable TV system then on Earth. It was in Virginia. It had 100 channels. I taped everything came across for one day. So I had 2,400 hours worth of television. And I took it home and spent a year, went to Sears, bought a recliner, spent a year watching all of this. And it was an interesting book. In some ways, it's one of the favorite things I've ever written. But the central insight of the, it's a book, so there were a lot of things that I wrote about, but the central insight of the whole thing was just the reminder that our culture is relentless in promoting the idea that you sitting there on the couch are the most important thing in the universe. You're the center of it all. And we've so come to believe that after 50 or 75 years of it, that we now call it human nature, and anytime anybody proposes anything that at all seems sort of idealistic or so that goes against human nature. Well, of course, there's some of that in our nature, or it wouldn't work, On the other hand, most human beings in most places in the world, in most times, have found their central identity someplace else, in the tribe, the community, in the relationship with the natural world or with God or some amalgam of those things, okay? They haven't been the absolute bright center of everything. And I think we realize at some deep level how unhealthy it is, maybe, to be that solipsistic and that self-absorbed. And that's the most amazing thing for me about getting out deep into the wilderness, It takes a couple of days for me of backpacking, if I go off by myself, before like the CNN in my own brain starts to die out, and this sort of steady chatter of opinions and fantasies and angers and whatever begins to die out a little bit, and I just begin to be some, And I think that's the great appeal probably of it. And for people living in different times and places, living much closer to that world, I think it probably had a very different appeal because it was just who they were, and they were. For us, there's an almost countercultural need to go do it, I think.
Okay, my second question: human population growth.
Yes.
Does it need to be reduced?
We talked about this earlier today.
Is it reducible?
We
And
talked
if
about
so,
this
how?
earlier today. I think that it's one of the few places where we've made real progress, for a number of reasons, but mostly because really powerful and interesting people in the developing world figured out that educating women and empowering them to one degree or another was a very effective contraceptive. We've managed to see, 30 years ago, the average woman in this world had 6 children. That number is under 3. It's going down. Human population isn't going to double again. It's going to go from 6 billion to maybe 9 billion by mid-century. That's a lot, but most of that increase now is just built into the age structure of the population and extremely difficult to slow down without kind of some disaster or something intervening. And at least in terms of global warming, that's not our biggest problem, because almost all that growth is going to come in places that use so little energy that it doesn't contribute an enormous amount to global warming. I gave the statistic earlier today that the average American family uses more power, more energy between the stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve and dinner on January 2nd than the average sub-Saharan African family uses in the course of a year. Okay, so the number of Malawians or whatever is not an important number in figuring out global carbon burden. The curve that we have to worry about, I think, more than population is consumption. It's continuing to rise exponentially, and we're continuing to spread our idea of what it should look like all around the world. And if we can't bring that under control, then, that's the out of control number at this point, more than population is. And you would think that it would be, you would think that fertility would be hardwired in some Darwinian sense into, that reproduction would be very difficult to control. It turns out that it's not. As I said, it's kind of dropped by half. It turns out to be quite plastic, quite pliable. Consumption so far, which you would think is a kind of cultural artifact, and is a cultural artifact, but that culture is so strong that it's driving it so powerfully that it's so far very difficult to slow it down, and that's what we got to do.
I remember being in England about 7 years ago and hearing that the United States had reneged on the Kyoto Treaty. And everybody in England was outraged. We came back to the United States and not a single person we talked to even knew what the Kyoto Treaty was. They were completely ignorant. The reason I'm bringing this up is because I wonder if we aren't in this room a little bit too America-centric. And I know you're starting a global program. But if you think about it, the Chinese were writing about the glories of nature and the smallness of man 4,000 years ago.
Yep.
The French have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the British have Darwin. I mean, just to name a few very important, significant environmentalists over the years that started long before Thoreau. I worry that if we pretend that we're leading the movement, that we won't alienate a lot of other people.
This is very important. I mean, we're no longer, it's true that modern environmentalism is an American invention. And all of its, most of the kind of innovations of the last 100 years have started here and spread around the world. The national park, the wilderness area, the Clean Air Act, all these sort of things that we pioneered. And proudly, we should take great pride in that. And it's one of the reasons why it's so shameful that we've now become not only the caboose on this train, but we're like, like the anchor tossed off the back of the caboose in an attempt to derail the whole thing. It's not that we just reneged on the Kyoto Treaty. We've done everything we can for the last 8 years to derail any attempt to negotiate the next one. Tried to disrupt meetings. Basically at international meetings now, the U.S. is just treated like the kind of crazy uncle who comes to Thanksgiving, and you have to sort of listen to his little outburst for a while before you go back to having the nice conversation that you're having with the family. And it's horrifying to see that happen. And it's one of the reasons, if we're going to, we need to do this work around the world. We need to do it very much in this country, because one of the things we have to do is not only solve our own problem, but we have to take some responsibility for helping the rest of the world solve its climate problem. The Chinese, are burning lots of coal right now, but they're burning it to pull people out of dire poverty. And there's still 600 or 700 million really poor rural Chinese. They're not going to stop burning it because, we make some moral case or something. They're the ones with the moral case because they know that we've filled the atmosphere by getting rich ourselves, burning cheap fossil fuel. They're only going to cut back on burning that coal if we're willing to make the real gesture of transferring some wealth and technology north to south to allow them to develop without having to burn that coal. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. And that's part of one of the reasons we need to spread this 350 idea around this country, not just around the rest of the world, because we need to start people realizing that this is, what's needed is something like the kind of Marshall Plan, but for carbon. And it's going to have to summon the same kind of spirit of generosity in this country and in the rich world in general, which at the moment, at least here, we're having a very hard time summoning. We're not in a very generous mood right now as a society, I don't think. And we're going to have to change if we have any hope of dealing with this. So I think your point is extraordinarily well taken.
On that note of what you were just talking about, I was wondering how you feel about nuclear energy.
It's a very good question, and one that people were discussing at the Stegner Symposium. My point of view is that, in certain ways, the risk, our understanding of risk has changed in the last 20 or 25 years, from the time when radiation and nuclear plants and things were perceived as the greatest risk that we could think of, to the point now where I think, frankly, a new coal-fired power plant is probably more dangerous than a new nuclear power plant. One represents the very real risk that something will go wrong eventually and cause problems. The other represents a guarantee that something will go wrong if it operates the way it's supposed to, you know. That said, I don't think nuclear power has much role to play, is going to play a very large role at all in the solution to this problem, and I think it's mostly because it's just too expensive. You know, give me the $6 billion that you're going to build on your spend on your new nuclear power plant or whatever the figures are in those range, and I'll show you a half dozen ways to get twice the carbon bang for the buck than building a huge new centralized power station. If it weren't for massive government subsidy, we wouldn't even be thinking about doing it, you know, sort of giving them the insurance policy against anything going wrong, whatever. No one would be thinking about doing it. I doubt that they're going to play a huge role. And I hope that the direction that we move in is much more in the direction of what the engineers call distributed generation. Smaller scale, more close to home, more distributed sources of power, which I think will allow us to put solar and wind energy and stuff to work far more quickly than we now imagine. But none of this is going to happen. None of these changes are going to happen in time if we just keep doing the kind of incremental, piecemeal, getting a little better sort of way that we're going now. We need, and the reason why this movement is so important, I think, and why we did step it up and why we're doing this 350 thing is because we need a mobilization in this country and then around this world equivalent to the one that we had at the beginning of World War II that transformed in a matter of months and the course of a year or so our entire economy and put it on a different footing and faced up to one of the greatest problems that the world had ever faced. We've got to do something like that again with that same kind of focus. And it won't be at all easy. And at the moment, it's not going to happen, and it won't happen unless we build a movement that's strong enough to make it happen. We shall see.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and experiences. You have written so much about global warming, so my question is about global warming. Now, geology textbooks, I'm a geologist, so I have a geological question. Yeah. Geology textbooks say that if you look at the history of the Earth's climate over the past, let's say 500 million years or so, what we have actually experienced over the past million years or so is the coldest period in the history of the Earth over the past 500 million years. So what is your answer to that? I agree that the anthropogenic cause of the carbon dioxide emission, I totally agree
right.
with that. But what is your answer to that question, especially with 350 ppm? Don't you think we are trying to play God in a way? Why 350? Why not 300? Why not 280? Why not 300? I mean,
well,
what is the... Yes.
Actually, going back to 275 would be a terrific idea, you know, because that's sort of what we know works. We're doing our best to be reasonable, and Jim Hansen and others have now said 350 represents an upper limit of what might be a safe zone. Now, it's true that 500 million years ago, the planet was warmer than it was now. There were some other things that were different about the planet then too, including the fact that, you know, there weren't anything like us around. At the moment, the scientific consensus is that without dramatic action in the short run, we've already raised temperature of the planet 1 degree. We'll see a further 5-degree increase in global temperature before the century is out. That would make the global average temperature about 65 degrees Fahrenheit, which is warmer than it's been not in, you know, human history, not in human prehistory, since way, way before the beginning of primate evolution, okay? You know, not to mention before we had coastal cities and before we had all the other features of our life. There's no way we can absorb that kind of change without catastrophic result for our civilization. Now, you're right, viewed on the largest possible time scale, who cares? I mean, the sun's going to blow up in 1 billion years anyway, so what the hell, you know? Bring it on, as the president would say. But you know, for whatever reason, and probably because of my immersion in both the wild and in the literature of the wild, you know, the late Pleistocene seems like a good thing, you know. This was the world that we were born into, and it seems more than the worthwhile work of a lifetime to try to somehow keep some of it intact by the time that we die. That may be as good as I can get. Thank you all very, very much.